There are men in my country who would like to become our next president who don't understand the science of climate change. They keep saying, I'm not a scientist, as if that was a reasonable explanation. Well, I believe they don't understand the issue because they aren't women. Any woman who knows how to boil a cup of tea can figure out climate change without being a scientist. I'm not a scientist either, but I figured out that when water boils, steam rises to the ceiling. The greenhouse gas, CO2, also rises from tailpipes and from factories. It forms a ceiling in the atmosphere because gravity won't let it escape, and it traps sunlight that would otherwise bounce off the earth and go back into space. It's a concept that's easy to understand as boiling water. Secondly, if you add lemon to your cup of tea, it becomes tart instead of sweet. This is an example of ocean acidification, because when CO2 emissions are absorbed by ocean water, it turns the water into an acid called carbonic acid. Creatures with shells, like the Pacific oyster, can't form their shells because the acid in the water won't let them. This is not just going to happen in the future, it's happening now. How do you make iced tea? You add ice cubes to your cup, and amazingly, the water level rises. Just like when the glaciers melt, there is more water flowing into our oceans, and the water level rises. When Lower Manhattan flooded during Hurricane Sandy, it wasn't a surprise, because the oceans have a greater volume of water in them than 10 years ago. Since greenhouse gas forms a ceiling, our atmosphere and our oceans are hotter. The heat makes water evaporate from the oceans. A water atmosphere holds more water, and then it comes down in huge megastorms, sometimes with 20 inches of rain in 2 days. Over land, the heat makes the water evaporate and causes drought. Ladies, I think we get this. We're not scientists, and we don't need to be. Research has shown that women's participation in government is vital for the passage of environmental legislation. Professor Carrie Norgaard and Professor York published a study called Gender Equality and State Environmentalism. They wanted to know whether women's participation in government had an impact on the signing of environmental treaties. Norgaard and York studied 2 different countries, Norway and Singapore. In 1990, the CSW estimated that a 30% presence was needed for women to influence legislation. Norway exceeded women's participation threshold at 36%. Singapore was low in women's participation, 4.3%. Norway has signed 13 out of 16 recent environmental treaties. On the other hand, Singapore has signed only 4 out of 16 recent environmental treaties. They concluded that states with a greater proportion of women in them, in their national governments, are more likely to ratify environmental treaties than other nations. As we work to save the environment from ecological collapse, it's imperative that we also work to improve the status of women. One of my heroes in this fight for climate justice, for the future of our children and grandchildren, has been Dr. James Hansen. He was the director of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies for 30 years. I believe he will be remembered in the future as a hero on par with Dr. Martin Luther King. Dr. King marched to save the civil rights of the African American people. Dr. Hansen is working to save life on Earth as we know it. He withstood the Bush administration's attempt to rewrite NASA's climate press releases and to cut NASA's funding. My artwork here, early Wednesday morning, examines his treatment in the press. This painting is based on Edward Hopper's early Sunday morning. Notice the horizontals in the roof and the verticals in the windows, and of course the barber pole. Hansen testified 25 years ago, in 1988, before the Senate's Energy Committee to warn our country that the greenhouse effect has been detected and it is changing our climate now. In 2008, 20 years later, he went back to Congress before the House Committee for Energy Independence and Climate Change. This time, he called for the chief executives of large fossil fuel companies like ExxonMobil and Peabody Coal to be put on trial for crimes against humanity and nature, for the destruction of Earth's atmosphere and oceans. How many people here read the Guardian newspaper? Well, if you weren't a regular reader of the Guardian newspaper in England, you would not have heard about this speech because it was never reported in an American newspaper. A few years later, in 2012, Dr. Hansen got arrested in front of the White House protesting the Keystone XL pipeline, a business venture he has called game over for the planet. Can you imagine America's leading climate scientist having to engage in civil disobedience? Here he is. Do you think the headlines were screaming, America's top climate scientist arrested at the White House? No. His arrest was barely reported in our national press. Not in the New York Times, not the LA Times, not in the Wall Street Journal, or the Detroit Free Press. The irony of this artwork is that it reveals the absence of news, not the presence. I only found the arrest mentioned in the Washington Post as if it was just a local story. Of course, it's not a local story. Wasn't it a source of national shame for our top climate scientist to get arrested at the gates of the White House with his supporters in order to be heard? Except that he still wasn't heard because the press here was silent. The question for all of us now is, does a free press mean that our press is free not to report the news? This is called Check, Checkmate. Check, Checkmate tracked the reporting of the recent 5th IPCC, the 5th assessment of the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The terms check and checkmate come from the game of chess. The point of the game is to capture the king. When the king is about to be trapped, you warn him by calling out, check! When the king can no longer escape, he is in checkmate when the game is over. This title was chosen because the climate deniers in this country were put in check by this report, written by hundreds of scientists all over the world, whose research confirmed the human responsibility for global warming. The report stated that climate change was unequivocally caused by humans and that we have only a 25-year window to lower emissions before hitting an irreversible threshold. American newspapers showed a partisan bias in reporting the 5th assessment. The New York Times, the LA Times covered the report on page 1. Wall Street Journal, page 9. Dallas Morning News, page 15. The handcuffs in the upper left-hand corner refer to the crime of ecocide. The kangaroo at the bottom symbolizes Rupert Murdoch's media empire, since he is Australian. He is the CEO of Fox News and the New York Post. His New York Post has never, ever reported any of the IPCC climate reports. If this isn't news suppression, I don't know what is. This newspaper has the 7th largest daily distribution in the United States. It is worth noting that up until last year, Bloomberg reported that the Saudi Arabian prince Al-Walid bin Talal owned 7% of the stock in Murdoch's company News Corporation, owner of the New York Post. Bin Talal currently owns 4.9% of the stock in 21st Century Fox, which produces Fox News. Conversely, Forbes and the Arab Press reported that Murdoch owns 19% of Rotana, the Prince's entertainment company in Saudi Arabia. They clearly have a business partnership. When the major source of funding in Saudi Arabia is from oil and gas interests, is it far-fetched to think that there may be an influence on the coverage of climate news? We have to infer that there might be a possible connection. Fox News is known for rampant climate denial. According to a 2014 study by the Union of Concerned Scientists, 70% of the climate news on Fox is misleading. Unfortunately, according to a 2015 poll conducted by St. Leo University, more U.S. adults believe Fox News is a reliable source of information about climate change than President Obama. The American public is being misled by a news organization that promotes itself as fair and balanced, which is untrue. I coined the phrase inverse propaganda at Princeton's Bernstein Gallery in an artist talk I gave there 3 years ago. Inverse propaganda is the absence or withholding of information vital to being an informed citizen. In this case, the non-reporting of the 5th assessment by Murdoch's paper, although this scientific study was reported by media around the world. Murdoch is therefore complicit in confusing the public through an absence of reporting about a climate crisis described in this UN assessment as a planetary emergency. My friends, our men have failed Mother Earth. Let us band together to save it. Please join your local environmental group or join a branch of 350.org, which is international, to work toward a world with clean energy. It is our generation that has been called to this task. It will be our generation that makes a difference in these perilous times. Let me close by repeating the famous words of Yeb Sano, former climate negotiator from the Philippines. If not us, then who? If not now, then when? If not here, then where? Thank you very much.